Chapter 18, The lamp burned low in Tim's room. He stood still for a moment, studying the place. The door at the back must be a closet. He took off his boots and put them on the hearth and padded over to take a look. The floorboards creaked, but he didn't care. Sounds in the room would go unnoticed for a little while. He opened the door without a sound. The closet was empty and there was a door at the back. Tim tried the knob but the door was locked. Boots sounded on the floor beyond and he heard a tapping on the other side. He answered the tapping and heard the stealthy turn of a key. The knob moved and the door opened and Red whispered, "You game for a try? Let's watch and listen for an hour or so." Red shut the door on his side of the closet but Tim left his ajar. He walked without stealth, as he might if he were preparing to go to bed, and set to work packing his haversack with the things that by now were warm and dry. There was a big tin of matches on the bedside table. He put it into his haversack and rolled his blanket and laced, 150, it across the top of the sack. He cleaned his teeth with a bit of salt, regretting the loss of the taste of the dinner, and packed the brush. He raised the lamp chimney and blew out the flame, opened both windows a crack and hung his blouse on the polished bedpost. He lay on the bed with his feet toward the pillows, his chin cupped in his hand, and looked into the cold December night. In the hall there was a scraping of chairs and mumbled talk. Tim heard McNeil bidding the guards good night, and then there was quiet. He thought, if we don't act now we'll be back in jail by tomorrow night. He felt his heart thumping against his ribs. If Kane had no sentries outside the house, they would make an attempt. They could jump to the ground. Tim moved to the window that faced the west. The scene was lit by a crescent moon. The leaves on the ground were stirred by gusts of chilly wind, and deep shadows lay across the grass. Lamplight winking beyond the trees showed Tim that the center of the village must be a half-mile or so northwest. As he traced the wagon road to the edge of the trees he heard the sound of hoofs on the frozen ground and a rider came around the bend, big in the saddle and turning his head to left and right. The rider was Kane, there was no doubt of that. As Kane came close Tim thought he saw an unlit lantern in the man's left hand, ready to be used as a signal perhaps. Kane was apparently doing the job himself. He passed the house, then shortly appeared again, riding back the way he had come. Before he reached the bend in the road he turned to the right and rode into a field to the west of the house. He paused in the middle, then cut back to the road again and disappeared behind the trees. 151, Tim felt suddenly cold and began to shiver. He moved quietly back to the bed, put on his blouse and lay down to wait. In less than an hour Red tapped at the door again. Tim had watched Kane make another tour much like the first. But now he was gone and everything was still. Tim went to the door and whispered to Red, "You've seen Kane, of course." Red nodded. "But I think my sentry has gone to sleep. And there's a door from this room to a storeroom at the back. If we drop to the ground behind the house, we can retrace our route for a mile or so to confuse the dogs. Then go for the railroad as we did before. They'd hardly expect that we'd do that." As Tim grasped his boots and his haversack a floorboard creaked. He stood stock still for half a minute, then moved through the door. "Put on your haversack," Red whispered. "We may have some running to do." They watched while Kane made another circuit of the farm. Waited a while and passed into the storeroom through a very small door. The window of the storeroom faced the back but it was smaller than the other windows of the house. Below it was a small shed roof. "That's a bit of luck," Red whispered. They struggled through the window and dropped to the roof and then to the ground with what seemed like a terrible chorus of noises. They stood for a moment, then moved along the back of the house. As they rounded the corner and started across the side yard McNeil's dogs set up a racket in an outbuilding beside the barn. The fugitives broke into a run, keeping the house between them and the place where they had last seen Kane. They gained the shelter of a stand of pines and paused, 152, to look back. Kane soon rounded a corner of the house, clearly confused as to which way to look. He reined in at the back of the house and looked toward the north, then dismounted, ran up the steps and rapped on the door. Tim and Red retreated into the trees. When they topped a little rise they ran along the road heading south. Just past a curve they found the place where the cows had crossed. Here they left the road and cut to the west across the field and through the grove of scrub oak and pine. As they ran down the hill they could hear the hounds. They reached the little brook and ran in the water for 100 yards or so until the sound of the dogs was disturbingly close. Then they dashed up the ridge toward the railroad track. They approached the track. They were gasping for breath and the baying of the hounds was sharp in their ears. Lanterns bobbed at the bottom of the hill. The hopelessness of flight struck Tim with sickening force. When they reached the track a new sound broke the air. The fugitives listened and the sound came again, the shriek of a whistle off to the south. Without a word to each other they jumped the track and ran like madmen along the embankment. Now the hounds were close, their baying rose above the roar of the approaching engine. A shot rang out, the train moved toward them, lumbering along at what seemed a snail's pace. The engineers must have seen the hunters. The whistle shrieked repeatedly. Tim looked over his shoulder and before he knew it the towering funnel stood above them, belching smoke and flame. The light of the headlamp flooded the rails. Now the hounds were just across the track, and Kane's figure rose in his stirrups as his horse shrieked and reared, 153, in fright. Tim ran at top speed, leapt to a flat car and hung on for his life. He worked himself onto the car, sank to the planks and rested a moment before he looked back. The car behind was a flat car, too, and Red was clinging to a stanchion in the middle of the car. Tim jumped to his feet, and above the thunder of the rolling cars the whine of a bullet split the air. He jumped the coupling, stumbled over some loose timber and grasped Red's arm, pulling upward with all his might. The ground slid past his vision like a crazy quilt. Something gave way and he lost his footing. He fell backward and hit the flat car with sickening force. At first his eyes were sightless and there was terrible thunder in his ears. Someone was shaking him and slapping his cheeks. He opened his eyes and saw Red bending over him. Tim said, "I thought I'd lost you." Red pointed to his ears and shook his head to show he couldn't hear. Tim lay still for a while. His head was splitting. When he raised it the light of the moon touched Red's face. Red's hair was wild and his cheek was cut and streaked with blood. As they rounded a curve Tim sat up and took in their situation. Ahead of the car he had boarded was one boxcar, shielding them from the fireman and the engineer. Behind, there were 3 more boxcars. A red lantern marked the end of the train but apparently nobody rode the last car. All the cars must be empty. They bounced and jerked until it seemed they would jump the track. A good horseman might keep up with the train for a while in open country, but he would find it hard in country like this. They had not traveled far when they entered a wood where the trees pressed close on either side. Red shouted. "How far to the end of the line?" 154, 35 or 40 miles at most. The train thundered onto a wooden trestle. The trestle groaned and the fish joints set up a chorus of screams. A milky mist rose from the dark, still waters surrounding the roots of the swollen trees. It drifted thinly through the moss and vines that hung unmoving in the chill night air. Red reached under his blouse and pulled out his watch. The cracked crystal glinted in the dim light. He stopped up one ear and pressed the watch against the other. Grinned and nodded. "Better ride less than an hour, I should think." The train jumped so much and the light was so bad that they couldn't read the hands through the cracks in the glass. Tim faced the rear of the car and lit a match. It was just past 10. He blew out the match. "Let's jump at 10 to 11. As the train left the trestle it slowed to pass through a sleeping village, then gathered speed again. Red asked, "You want to sleep?" Tim shook his head and lay on his back and watched the moon and the stars standing in the heavens as the train barreled through the night. When they next lit a match it was 11:15. Tim was uneasy. It seemed to him the train was slowing down. He said, "Let's jump." Red got to his feet. "I'll go first." "Jump wide." He gripped a stanchion and watched the ground below them, blurred by the speed of the train. The land was flat and grassy with a thicket here and there. Red reared back and jumped into the wind and Tim followed, flexing his knees against the shock of the ground. At the moment of jumping, the air sucked him back while the train roared on. He hit the ground and rolled clear of a patch of undergrowth. He felt as if one knee was twisted, but when he got to his feet it seemed all right. 155, Red came out of a bramblebush, cursing and laughing. Tim stood up. The strap of his haversack had broken and some of his clothes were scattered on the ground. He fumbled for them while Red fixed the strap by tying the ends together with a clumsy square knot. As the thunder of the train became a distant rumble, Tim pointed north across the dark landscape to the shapes of the hills beyond. If we walk fast, we'll be at the border by dawn. Red hooked his hands around the straps that held his haversack. And what does it look like, Timmy boy? Is it a bright green ribbon 20 feet across? 156, Chapter 19, As the sky grew light in the east they came to the edge of a rolling pasture. They climbed a knob of land but couldn't see a farmhouse or a barn or any other signs of life, so they walked in the pasture at the edge of a wood. They topped another rise and there was a tethered cow. It seemed she had been there all night. Her udder was bulging and her teats touched the tips of the winter grass. Red's eyes sparkled. The poor thing is suffering something terrible, carrying such a load of milk. Tim moved up to the cow, clucking and talking in a soothing voice. He took the tin cups and kneeled in the grass and milked. They drank and milked, and mixed milk with roki egg and ate a ration of mush. Tim filled their canteen and then, in a spirit of fun, he milked straight into his mouth. He got to his feet and patted the cow and she turned her head and gave him a gentle bovine stare. Tim said, I wish we could take her along. Might cramp our style when we cross the mountains. A shout broke the air and they saw a man about 100 yards to the east, running with a shotgun in one hand and a milk pail in the other. As they crashed into the cover of the nearby trees they heard a bang and Red was seized by a frenzy of high-spirited mirth. The man's ungrateful. That's what he is. They walked for an hour or so and sat on a patch of grass to rest. The day had dawned clear and warmer. Tim reached for the map and spread it out against his knee. They had made good time the night before, heading straight north over level, lightly wooded country, following a road for a while and crossing a deep-cut river on a stout wooden bridge. The night had been just right for walking, just nippy enough to give them spirit. They must be close to the border now. Tim marked an X where he thought they were and read the compass. They had kept the broad river on their left to a point a few miles south of McNeil's farm. There the river had parted from the northwesterly direction of the track, flowing straight down from the north. They had crossed it on a high bridge. Now as they moved due north they would strike the river again just after they crossed into North Carolina. They made up their minds to follow the Broad until they reached the foothills of the Blue Ridge. In the mountain country Kate's map seemed less than complete, but on the far side of the mountains, in the upper left-hand corner of the map, Knoxville was neatly lettered. The railroads and roads that converged on the city were clearly shown. As Tim put the map away he slapped at his pocket and remembered that Kane still had his diary and album of photographs. Tim didn't mention his loss to Red. He lay back on the grass and closed his eyes and tried to bring Kate's face to 158 mind. He started by remembering her photograph but that didn't work. He thought of how she walked and danced and the way she turned her head. That brought her alive, but try as he would he couldn't make her face come clear. Red chewed the end of a piece of grass. A penny for your thoughts. You don't have a penny. I'll owe it to you. I wouldn't have you carry a burden of debt. Tim opened his eyes, sat up on the grass and watched a little gray bird fluttering and chirping in the underbrush. I was trying to remember Kate's face, but it wouldn't come clear. Nancy's face doesn't often come clear anymore. Red stood up. We better find cover and sleep a while. We've been lucky. I hope it will last. They walked until they found a grove of pines and laid out the poncho and blankets and slept until just after noon. Then they found a little stream and drank and doused their heads and moved on without eating. They were keeping the milk to mix with roki egg at supper time. That evening the sky began to cloud. During the day they had circled some cabins but they hadn't seen a road or a town. Now, as it began to grow dark, they came to a road that ran northwest and decided to follow it. When they had traveled a mile or two they rounded a bend and a young colored man and his girl appeared before them in the middle of the road. The girl shrank back, and the man stood rooted to the ground, staring at the strangers. "You have nothing to fear," Tim said. The young man said, "Please don't tell you saw us here." Red laughed and moved closer. "If you won't tell that you saw us here." 159. The young man lowered his head and strained his eyes. "Lordy, you wearin' uniforms." The girl trembled so hard she could barely speak. "What would Yankees be doin' here?" Tim said quietly, "We're making our way north. We haven't had an easy time." The man studied their tattered uniforms. "Well, I guess not," he said. "Wish we could help you, but all the colored folks hereabouts muse be inside by sundown." Red said, "You can help us most by forgetting you saw us. Have we crossed into North Carolina yet?" "No, massa. Old North State is 1 mile more." The man looked down at his bare feet. "I thought to go north to fight for Massa Lincoln, but I got no shoes." The girl turned to her man. "Don't go away," she pleaded softly. Red's face was serious. "You better not try it without any shoes." He looked into the shadows. "Will we be safe if we travel this road?" The young man turned and motioned with his arm. "Go left, when you come to the fork. Hide in the trees if you hear a sound." As the white men started down the road the girl called after them, "God keep you safe." On the morning of the third day after they had crossed into North Carolina they slept at the bottom of a broad cleft in a massive rock. At the top of the rock the rift was narrow so that the crack formed a sheltered cave. The floor of the cave was dry and the men were tired. They slept much later than usual. Tim was awakened by a violent cramp. They had eaten the last of their food 2 days before. He lay on his back, 160, and stared at the walls of rock. It was bitter cold. If they hoped to go on they would have to find food by nightfall. Tim studied Red's face, thin and sunken under his bristling beard. Red stirred in his sleep and moaned and settled down again. Tim bent his knees and sat up, stretched, and crawled to the mouth of the cave. The ground outside was in the grip of a heavy frost. Tim faced a long, steep hill dotted with poplar and spruce. At the bottom of the hill, in a winding valley, a river glistened in the afternoon sun and the sound of running water came to his ears. Beyond the valley, above the delicate fringes of purple and gold, a mighty ridge stood proud against the sky. Last night, and in the early hours of this morning they had traveled 15 miles or so without a halt, pushing onward to forget their hunger and bring themselves nearer to people who might help. Behind them was their first high ridge. They had crossed it in the blackness of a cloudy night, hardly aware of the dizzying heights until they reached the top. Then, looking back, they saw the shapes of the cliffs and rocks tumbling downward into the darkness, giving them sudden vertigo. The country ahead was wild and rugged. If they had a rifle they could live on game, but as it was they could only hope for a chance to beg. As Tim idly studied the valley below he thought he heard a voice. He listened closely. It must be his imagination. There was nothing now but the sound of water. The squawk of a crow on the wing. It came again, louder at first, then carried away on the wind. In a minute or two Tim heard horses breaking the underbrush across the river. Through the trees he could see a column of cavalry wading in, pausing in the middle to water their horses. 161, with the sun in his eyes, and from this distance it was hard to see their uniforms, but they were gray, not blue, that much was certain. Tim slipped back into the cave and shook Red's arm. Red pulled back and turned away. Tim shook his shoulder and Red sat up suddenly, wild-eyed, as if he'd been having a nightmarish dream. Tim pressed his hand to his lips and motioned to Red to come with him to the mouth of the cave. Red shook his head and blinked, then crawled up and perched beside Tim. The cavalrymen had begun to ride up the hill, moving now at a pretty good clip, away from the cave. Red squinted dazedly into the sun. "Those are federal uniforms." There was something wild in his voice. He gave a shout and jostled Tim as he burst free of the cleft in the rock and stood in full view. He was raising his hands to his mouth, to shout again, when Tim gave him a shove and knocked him to the ground. As Red rolled over, angry and surprised, Tim pinned him to the ground. Those riders are Rebs. Red glared and tried to roll free, then suddenly relaxed. Are you positive? Positive. I was watching them before I woke you. Tim peered around the rock to see if the riders had heard Red's shout, but the last one was just disappearing behind a little rise, going the same way as before. Red sat up with a haunted expression on his face. He spoke softly without turning around. Did they hear me shout? Apparently not. Red was breathing hard. He didn't speak. Tim sat down nearby, quiet for a minute or two before he spoke. I shouldn't have wakened you suddenly. 162, Red's eyes rested on the valley, watching for signs of other horsemen following the first. Tim said, it could have been I who did that. But it wasn't. You're just as hungry, but not so hungry that you made yourself see ghosts. I'd been awake. I had time to consider. But think of a man like Couts for instance. Can you imagine him doing what I did just now? He might have made the same mistake. Tim smiled. Couts would have convinced me I was wrong. Not likely he would have made such a devilish big mistake. Couts was a professional soldier. When you and I were fighting men we made ourselves think as soldiers think, but Couts thought that way every minute of his life. You mean we aren't soldiers anymore? We're the hunted, not the hunters, now. It changes a man. It frightens me sometimes when I lie awake in the gray light of dawn. Red smiled at last. I wonder where Couts is now. God knows. Maybe back with the 7th again. I hope he is. Red squinted into the lowering sun. Let's push on until we drop. We should take a chance, if we see a cabin, Tim said. Another day without food will finish us. We better not knock on any cabin doors after dark. Someone's liable to shoot first and ask questions later. The cavalry detachment had made them wary. They kept a careful watch as they approached the crossing and waded in. They followed the trail the horsemen had used until it branched east. There was plenty of water and they drank as often as they found a spring or a mountain stream. 163, as the shadows of night crept up the ridge the men were so tired they could barely move. They were thinking of resting when Red noticed a pinpoint of light in the gloom several hundred yards beyond them in the direction of the ridge. Our fate lies there, he said. Before we're tempted to knock on the door we better bed down for the night. They woke before dawn. There wasn't a sign of the light in the trees, so they waited until the sky turned pink in the east. As they gathered up their things and made themselves ready it seemed to Tim that he felt even worse than he had last night. The cold sliced into his bones and the landscape swam before his eyes. He noted that Red must feel the same. He swayed as he struggled with his haversack. Tim felt the beat of his heart as they started walking through the trees. They hadn't traveled 300 yards when they found themselves at the edge of a clearing. There were stumps all around. The trees had been cut, maybe 2 or 3 years before, and some of the land had been farmed. In the middle of the clearing was a cabin. A curl of wood smoke twisted away from the chimney, carried off on the morning breeze. Behind the house was an outhouse and a shed, both rudely built. The soldiers moved up slowly with their hands held away from their sides. When they were halfway up the slope a woman came around a corner of the cabin. At first Tim thought she was unarmed. Then he saw a pistol in her hand. Her voice came strong. Straighten up and come along. When they were closer she said, in the purest mountain accent, I saw men play at bein' tired before. Then she cocked her head and strained forward. No, by gum, you're not play-actin' at all. The men stood on the frozen ground. Swaying slightly, 164, waiting for the woman to make the next move. She was of medium height and probably no more than 20. She wore a Mother Hubbard of rough homespun cloth drawn tight across her breasts, cinched in at the waist with a man's wide leather belt. Her raven hair hung loose to her shoulders and her skin was tanned. She looked at them hard with piercing black eyes. Tim looked down at the gun in her hand. It was a Colt revolver, cocked, well-oiled and in good condition. The hand that held it was muscular but a woman's hand nevertheless. Neither man lowered his eyes before her gaze. At last she spoke again in her husky twang, more quietly than before. You are the saddest, most miserable pair of hounds I ever saw. Surely those can't be soldiers' uniforms. Neither man spoke. She looked at Red. You got a tongue, Redbeard? Red smiled faintly. Too tired to use it, ma'am. Well, at least you got one. She turned to Tim. You Slim, you got a tongue. Tell me what you're doing here. Making our way across the mountains, ma'am. Now don't you suppose that's plain? What I mean, are you Yankees or rebels? That's what I have to know. Neither man answered. Now you don't know which one I am or why I should give a hang at all. She tossed her head. Tell you what I'll do. Without my help you'll never cross the Smokies alive. If you answer wrong, I'll send you on your way. She squinted and smiled a humorless smile. I'd like the truth. Red stood straight and looked right into the woman's eyes. We're Yankee soldiers, ma'am. The woman's expression barely changed. I thought as 165, much, though I never did see a Yankee uniform. Old Buck helped other Yankees cross the mountains back last summer. The woman's face was still hard but she said, Lordy, you boys are shiverin' somethin' awful. Come along inside. Chapter 20, the men slept fully clothed on a wide bunk bed on a big straw mattress. Tim stirred in his sleep, opened his eyes and propped up on one elbow. The big brown room was warm. The woman still sat in her high-backed rocker, her sewing in her lap and her revolver glinting in her hand. She was looking straight at Tim. She had nursed them like a mother since yesterday morning, cooking for them and mending their clothes, and making them rest to get back their strength. She had spent most of the time making overcoats from blankets. She had cut and sewn as if the devil were after her, working with unbelievable speed. Tim swung his feet to the floor and pulled his boots on. He stood on the rough plank floor. Red still slept. Tim walked to the hearth, put on a couple of logs and stirred up the embers. He stood with his back to the fire. His eyes rested on the revolver in her hand. You won't be needing the pistol to keep us in line. The woman raised her eyes. Are all Yankee soldiers like you and Redbeard, good-mannered and kind? 167, I guess not, ma'am. You told me your husband and some other men from these parts had joined with the Yankees in the West. We aren't the only Yanks you've seen. She almost spat. Why, they're not Yankees like you at all. They're mountain men. She threw back her head and laughed. You and Redbeard are men, don't get me wrong. Just a different breed, that's all. She put her revolver deliberately on the table by her chair. All right, she said. She looked into the fire, seeming softer and more womanly now. Late that afternoon she brought in some rabbits to butcher for stew. Red went out with Tim to cut and carry firewood. They went to a tree that had fallen close to the little privy. Tim took the first turn with the axe. The blade bit the bark and Red said, funny how she settled on our names right away, Redbeard and Slim. That's pretty close. But she's not much of a one for names. Just Mrs. Flint. We were lucky to find out what name she went by at all. Tim severed the trunk with a final blow and started another cut. What did you talk about this morning, Mr. Slim? She's been like sunshine today. Tim smiled. Now she knows we're gentlemen. I see. What a life the woman has, Tim said, looking at the empty shed. No husband, no horse, cow died last spring and her hound died just a week ago, she said. Nancy's a sturdy little thing, but I can't imagine her living like this. They swung through the door and stumped across the sagging floor to watch the woman work. There were 2 pots swinging over the blazing fire and she was cutting, 168, chunks of rabbit and potato into one. The other held corn mush. Tim could tell by the smell, ma'am," Red said, "we shouldn't eat up all your food this way." The woman finished cutting and threw the last of the bones and waste into a cracked china bowl on the hearth. She wiped her hands on her apron and sat in her rocker. "That's foolish talk. I can shoot a rabbit as good as any man, with a pistol even. This summer I grew enough corn to feed a regiment and vegetables too. Then there's old Buck in the village in the valley. He heads up a bunch o' Union men, part of a band they call True Heroes of America. They hide men out so they won't have to fight with the rebel army. Well, old Buck has a store, and if I need a thing, old Buck gives it to me. Nate Flint'll pay when he comes home, he says. I look at him straight last time and says, maybe Nate Flint will never get home. And old Buck purrs just like a hooty owl and says, maybe I'll fall out of bed tonight and break my neck. The men settled on a bench across from the rocker and all three were quiet. Just sniffing the strong aroma of stew, the woman stirred the pots with a hand-cut wooden spoon. She tasted the stew and sat down, leaning forward toward the men. Tonight I will finish the coats, she said. By morning it will be 2 nights of sleep and plenty of food to give you strength. You better go. Tim said, we have to go, ma'am, much as we might like to stay. About the coats, have you used all your blankets to make them? The woman's brows went up. I never did see such men as you. I got 2 left, and one's a plenty. I mean to cut the other one into strips and roll them for carrying. You, 169, can wrap your feet and legs when the snow gets deep enough that the cloth won't wear right through. But, ma'am, it's windy hell you boys are looking for. Take my word. Don't be soft in your heart toward me. After supper the woman leaned over the rough plank table that stood at the side of the room, near a pallet she had made herself to sleep on. She pulled the lamp close and blew out the flame. I'll have to be beggin' some oil from Buck the next time I go down. I can pay him with animal skins. Red scratched his beard. Why don't you spend the winters in the village, ma'am? Slim and I are worried about you being alone up here. The wind whistled at the corner of the cabin and the fire blazed up, filling the room with pumpkin light and jagged shadows. I spent last winter in the village, she said, but I figured to spend this winter here. Nate and we made this place with our own 2 hands and a few odd tools. We lived in the village once and Nate used to hunt. But everyone else was a hunter, too, so we couldn't make out that way. One day he says, we're cuttin' loose from this village, little girl. We'll build a cabin in the mountains where no man can tie a string on me. She faltered. But you may be right. Her eyes grew fierce in the flickering light and her hand went pale where it gripped the table. Just last fall I was out by the shed when 2 wild men came whoopin' and hollerin' out of the mountain. Rebel guerrillas they was. They wanted more than food and drink, it didn't take much to see. I had my musket and I yelled loud and clear for them to turn away but they just kept comin', Logan, and hollerin', so I picked them off, the one behind and, 170, then the other. I buried them in the ravine over yonder. The woman gave Red and Tim a desperate look. Did I do right? I never told another soul. Red nodded. You gave them their chance to turn away. I didn't want to keep their horses. And I buried their rifles with them. I slapped the horses off down the trail toward the village. She turned to the fire. I'm a one-man woman. There's no change in that. Tim said quietly, spend the winter in the village. Don't be too proud for that. Next morning all 3 woke just after dawn. They went about their chores as if they might have lived together in the cabin for a month or 2. Tim fetched wood and built a fire. Red pumped up water and set a kettle on the hearth, hung the covered pot of mush on the crane. Put on logs and stirred the fire to life. The woman put on her doeskin jacket and went outside. When she came back she said, "Laws, it's nippy outside." Tim went to the window in the front of the cabin. The frame had been made to hold a sash that must have been used before. A few flakes of paint still clung to the wood. Tim studied the frost that had formed inside the glass at the bottom. The crystals had made an intricate pattern, like ghostly seaweed frozen in place. The morning light made the crystals sparkle like crushed diamonds. Tim turned away and fetched his toothbrush. He and Red took a cup of water and a pinch of salt and went outside. After breakfast, when Tim looked at the window, the pattern of frost had disappeared, dissolved by the heat of the fire. The woman had mended their haversacks and finished the overcoats. They were great, heavy garments, 171, the color of natural wool. They'll blend with the snow, the woman said. She packed the haversacks with meat and cornmeal. They could make corn cakes. She tied a long coil of blanket wool to each sack. After breakfast she got up from the table and went to a corner and brought out a can. I almost forgot the cookin' pot, she said. Can't cook without a pot. The men got up and put on the coats, admiring the woman's handiwork while she helped them on with the haversacks. I reckon the coats make the straps set different than before, she said. She rolled the blankets and the poncho and secured them over the packs with lengths of thong. Tim said, "You're spoiling us, ma'am." "Old Smoky won't spoil you none, that's sure." She looked them over and turned away. She put on her jacket and boots, took some mittens and a couple of mufflers from a backless old chair in a corner by the fire. "Take the mufflers," she said. "Nate went larkin' off when it was warm. He said the Yanks would fix him up with clothes." She hung a pair of stoppered gourds around her shoulder and a pouch and a little sack of meal. She picked up her musket and took the pistol from the table. "Redbeard, you take first turn with the pistol." Red said, "No, ma'am, you keep the colt. I got the musket. It's notched already and I'll notch it again if I must." "Take the pistol. It's loaded and there's a flask of powder and some extra balls at the top of Slim's pack." Red put out his hand and took the revolver. "I decided to spend the winter in town." She looked, 172, up at Tim. "It was what you said about bein' too proud that changed my mind. Nate used to say I was foolish proud sometimes." All three went outside, the woman carrying the musket. When the men turned to say goodbye she said, "I'm goin' too." Red said, "But, ma'am," it was the first time they had seen her smile. "Don't worry. I won't follow you to camp. I just want to set your feet in the right direction." The ground rose slowly, dipped to a shallow valley, then climbed again to the ridge that stood against the sky like a shoulder of God. Tim said, "Go back if you want. You can point out the way from here." Her tan cheeks had a ruddy glow. She ran her hand through her hair and tossed her head. She looked up at the ridge, then down at the frozen ground. "I was goin' huntin', anyway. I'll walk with you a while. I don't know Knoxville, never been there, but I know which way it is, all right." They were toughened by the walking of the past few weeks and rested now and well fed, so that the climbing wasn't bad at all. The slopes abounded in mountain laurel and ginseng. Tim thought how the place must look in spring with the shrubs and nut trees in bloom. They traversed a half-mile of loose rock, deep and uncertain on a steep slope. They stopped at the top and rested a minute. Red grabbed at a sapling for support and the woman said, "Don't trust yourself to little trees. If the roots give way they take you with them down the mountain." She sniffed the air. "Snow soon." 173, Red said, "That ridge must be 6 miles from here, or more." The woman looked back. Her bright eyes swept the valley once and she picked up her musket and moved forward.